All right, so now we're down to pretty exciting part of the process is applying the finish. So let's talk a little bit about finishes. All the finishes are an oil-based of some form or an oil-based. They'll have some linseed in it. And what you're going to find is probably very confusing, as I found. And for every perspective on how to finish the wood, it's going to be about like barbecue. Everyone's got their own recipe in terms of how they're going to finish the wood and what they're after. And so you'll continue your research on, but I'll give you some tips on what I found. And there's two key things that you want to keep in mind. There's either a surface finish, which is pretty common on a lot of factory-made guns. It's a shellac, and it's sort of a builds up on the surface type finish. The other finish is it soaks into the wood. And that type of finish, then you actually are feeling the wood, and it has a feel to it that's very different than sort of the shellac finishes or the finishes on the surface. The other key thing you're going to remember is the wood that you're going to be working with. Now this is a Clara walnut, and if my assistant will focus in, Clara walnut has lots of little grains and pores in it. And so they're just all over. Now a lot of times you'll see here where we did some work with some black epoxy and dyed it black, here and back in here. Okay, now you can step back. But at the end of the day, there's different woods. So this being a Clara walnut, I've chosen a finish that works best for me. If this had been a French walnut or a maple or a tighter grain when you're finishing this, I would have used a different finish. So the two finishes that I've worked with, the first is Gunstock Finishing by Joe Balicki. You can get this from Brownells. In my opinion, this is the best finish to work with. This type of finish soaks into the wood. It's easy to repair, and it is a finish that will last. Because he's documented this process, I'm not going to explain everything that he's done, but what I am going to do is tell you some things that I've done. What he's using is permalin sealer. Now there's two different kinds. There's one that's a finish. This is a sealer. He uses this, and then he does a wet sand on the wood. And he goes from essentially a 220 all the way down to 1,000 grit. It's as fine a finish, in my opinion, to work with. It is a lot of work. It's a lot of sanding and wet sanding. And the problem that I have with this type of porous wood is that as you continue to wet sand, you open up pores and you end up with lots of little shiny spots. And I prefer that finish, but not for this piece of wood. This starts to set up very fast. So what I'll do is I'll use Brownells Bull Linseed Oil. And I'll use 3 parts of the permalin sealer, 1 part of the double boiled linseed oil, and that allows me to have a longer work time with it. If you're in cooler climates, probably can get away with just working with this, but I will cut it with boiled linseed oil to give me a longer work time. So that's his process, and again, in my opinion, that is my preferred finish that I would work with. Because this wood is so porous, what I'm going to use is Truel. This is probably the easiest finish you'll ever work with, and it's pretty much foolproof. It's really a matter of, and now this is going to be a surface finish. So this type of finish is a layering process, and you'll build up layers to get that shiny coat. The finish that Joe uses out of the box is more of a matte finish, whereas this is going to be more of a shiny finish. And what it does for me is it fills in the pores, and then it creates a real shiny look to it. So I like this finish, but it is nowhere near as durable as the finish that Joe Balicki goes through. Now, durable, I'll shoot 10,000 rounds a year, so every year I'm taking my guns down, replacing springs, and I touch them up. So if it's a hunting gun, depending on how much use the gun, this finish will probably last you for a decade or more. So don't misunderstand, it's a good finish, but for a target shooter, this finish will not hold up, but it is a good finish. Again, what I'll do with this finish is because there's so much oil and linseed oil in it, if you look at the compound, what I will do is I'll cut this with mineral spirits. And what this allows me to do is to thin it out just a little bit. Again, in Texas it gets pretty hot. This starts to set up real fast. The mineral spirits allows me to cut it. It gives me a longer work time. So that's what I'm doing. And again, I use probably about a 3 ratio of this to 1 of mineral spirits. So at this point now then, we're ready to go on and work with this. And the first step that we need to do is, remember in earlier videos I talked about sandpaper. In my opinion, I think sandpaper is probably the worst thing you could ever do. Well, why? What sandpaper does is it actually compresses the grain down. And when you start to apply a finish, what you get are fibers of the wood, and they stick up, and it gives it a rough feel. And so what we're going to do is we're going to, a lot of times it's referred to as whiskers. What we're going to do is we're going to raise the whiskers, knock them off, and repeat the process. And the way I do that is I have a damp washcloth. This washcloth is not, it's not soaking wet in water, but it's very wet. So what we're going to do is we're just going to dampen this down. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use a torch. Now, one of the things I want you to watch is the blue part of the flame and the yellow part of the flame. I'm just using that yellow part of the flame, and you'll notice now then you'll see as you reach that, it'll start to dry out, and that's all you're wanting to do. See right there, it starts to dry out. You are not cooking the wood. All you're doing is you're lightly, and you want to keep this propane torch moving. You do never want to stop, particularly around when you get at corners, is where you can get yourself in a little bit of trouble. So keep this propane torch moving. Yellow part of the flame, flash off the water, and all we're doing is we're just going to raise that grain up. And again, we've not soaked this down, we're not taking it in a bath or anything. We're just lightly soaking the washcloth. Now these corners, as I said, when I get up to the corners, I just want you to watch what I'm doing. I'm moving very quickly and never let it stay in one place. You just keep it and keep the yellow part on it. Never get down to that blue part. That's going to be the hardest part of this, and you do not want that blue part getting too close there. Now on this top grain here, what I'm doing is I'm just going to move here and just very quickly go over it. Okay. Now, what you're going to do is it's going to be hard maybe to see it, but you can certainly feel it. And what you're looking for, the areas where the grain's been raised up, and you're just going to sand that off, usually like right in here. So if you can zoom in here. Right in here, you'll notice that grain, how it's kind of popped up. It's not so easy to see, but when you run your finger over it, you can feel it. And that's why they refer to it as sort of whiskers. And this is what you're wanting to get rid of. And you can feel everywhere else it feels, well, even everywhere actually, even back around in these corners. But that's probably, hopefully you can see that and how that grain right there has been kind of raised up. And like I said, it's easier to feel sometimes than it is to actually describe it. What we'll do is we're taking 320 grit sandpaper. You're not sanding on this, you're just letting this ride over top of this. And you're going to go over the entire gun stock again to get rid of all those areas where the grain's been raised up. So this is the process. I'll repeat this about 3 times. That is probably the #1 secret all gun finishes or all woodworking has in common, is the preparation of the wood. And I've done my mixture here. I'm using the Truel on this because of the grain that we talked about. I've got about a 3-part Truel and 1 part on the mineral spirits. And what I'll use in terms of application, you could use an acid brush, or I like to use a sheet. You can go to Walmart or something, get a cheap sheet. Don't use like a cotton t-shirt, but use a sheet. The cotton, it leaves fibers behind or something in it, and so I use a sheet, and I just like to dip it in there, this being sort of a base, what I'm doing on here, and I'll just run it in there, and it's I like I said, it's pretty exciting. Start to see what the grain of the wood's going to look like in terms of how it's going to look, particularly when it's got kind of like a wetness to it. And this is going to be one beautiful piece of wood. So anyway, so this, and again, I just like using this. It just gives me a little bit more control of where I'm putting it versus letting it run around. And you're just going to give that piece of wood and all of this that it wants. You just give this, just liberally applying this all you want. Now, because on this particular project, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a fleur-de-lis pattern. What I'll do is I'll put about 2 coats of this on there, and that protects the wood from any oils on my hand, and then I'll checker it, and then I'll go ahead and finish the finish. So that's one advantage of using this type of finish, is that you can go ahead and not have to finish the wood. On the other process, where you're using the permanent sealer there, you're going to wet sand everything, and it's pretty much you're going to finish and then you're going to checker. And again, this is just sort of a preference on this particular project. What I want to do is I want to use a checker pattern that's a little bit more advanced for me. And usually what that means is that if I have little tiny mistakes that I need to clean up, it's just easier to fix checkering mistakes before you finish. And plus this finish allows you to go ahead and do something like that, because you can always come back, and they use it's like a steel wool, and you'll just buff it down and keep applying coats until you get the sheen that you want. One last comment here before we wrap up on this is that this finish here, the true wool, you can expect this to skim over. That's okay. If when you start pouring this in here, it should look like motor oil or cooking oil as you're pouring it in. If you see little globules, if you will, I'm not sure the right term, but it'll sort of be, throw this stuff away and go get you another one of these. Now, I like buying these little 3 fluid ounces. These will last me a couple of projects. But like I said, if that if it skims over, that's no problem. You can crack it, but when you pour it in there and you get the little globules in there, throw it away. On the permanent sealer, if this skims over, throw it away. You only have really one project you can do with this. Once you open this, you sort of have a shelf life, if you will, of about 3 weeks, roughly. The linseed oil that you put and mix in here will give it a little bit longer life, so you might have another container. But once it skims over, it's trash, throw it away, it's no good. So you can only use this for one project, really. Okay, so where we're at in the process, I went ahead and applied probably 3 or 4 coats of true wool on this. And remember, true wool is a surface finish, so it's a layering process. You're going to put on very thin coats, multiple coats. I can put up to 2 to maybe 3 coats a day, and just a very, very thin coat, and build this up. When I went out to the pattern board, I wasn't happy with the pattern, and so what I did was my pattern was off to the right, and it was a little too high. So to lower my point of impact, I brought the stock down, just, I don't know, maybe a 64th of an inch. I wanted to bring my pattern down. I like about a 60-40 spread. And my beads, my front bead, this would be my front bead, my center bead was over to the right. So I brought this side in a little bit to bring my sight picture to where my beads were lined up. And that brought my pattern back over to the left and then aligned where I wanted it. Now when you sand on this, remember, you're going to sand through. If you're going to take down, if you're going to bring down the comb, you're going to be sanding into the wood. And you can leave, you want to make sure that you get all these little sanding marks out of here again. And so what I use 320 grit after I finish my sanding. And you're just going to let this ride over this, and you're going to have to inspect it very, very carefully, because you do not want any wood sanding marks remaining in this wood, because the finish, it's not going to fill that in. Depending on how the light hits it, you'll still see where the sanding marks were in the wood. That's different than if, say, for example, here in this area, you'll notice how you can kind of scuff that up. Well, that's no big deal.
actually the Truol itself will fill in this finish, and it'll just sort of blend that in, and you'll never even see those scratches. So the wood scratches, very, very important. You want to make sure if you alter your stock that you use that 320 grit and you get all the sanding marks out of it. It's almost like you're going back to the very beginning with the wood here. In the process of using the Truol finish and you're layering up, after a while the finish, it'll feel a little bumpy or it'll feel uneven, and you might even potentially, if you put too much Truol on there, you might even have some runs. Now, I am not a big favor of steel wool. There's absolutely nothing about steel wool that I particularly like, but the steel wool, the reason why I don't like it is these little fibers can break off and embed itself into the wood. But for this particular finish, you're okay. So what I use is steel wool, and what you'll do is you just scuff over those areas. Now, this would be true if at the end of the year or you wanted to touch up your stock. You can use this triple aught steel wool, and you can just buff out of the finish any of those scratches. I'm not buffing into the wood. I'm only buffing that surface layer of the finish. And so what you'll do is you'll go over the entire stock or areas that you want to rub it down to get all the little imperfections. Now, you're not removing the finish, you're just scuffing off the very top layer of this finish, so you're not really sanding it. Even though I'm doing this, that Truol is still there. It's just you've just scuffed off the top of the top finish here. Now completed the gun stock. I've got probably 10 to 13 coats of Truol on this. And again, just as a repeat, after 2 or 3 coats, you're going to take triple aught steel wool, buff it down, and then you're going to apply very thin coats. Just also on this topic here on the coats, when you're applying the Truol, even though you may have thinned it with some mineral spirits, once you've applied it, you're going to go in circles and you're going to go around, as I was showing, putting it on there. When you move over to the other side, don't come back and try to reapply it. It will already start to set here. So again, just use thin coats, wiping it on. Once you finish this section, you go to another section. Don't come back. You'll find it's already starting to set up, and it's easier just to apply when that dries, and you can put 2 to 3 coats on this. On the checkering, this is, if I get a zoom in here on the checkering. Checkering turned out very happy with the checkering on this, pattern on that. And then on the trigger guard, I decided to go ahead and go with red brass. What I did was I took some copper fittings that were red brass copper fittings, and it's just copper with a mixture of a little bit of copper, and that gives it sort of a rose color. And so I decided to go with brass and just the red brass, and it seemed to turn out to be really what I liked. At first, I wasn't sure about the contrast and the colors, but now that I've looked at this, I'm actually pretty happy with this. There was one area, this area here, there was some sand that got in there, and I guess it's not going to show up. It's no big deal, but there was some sand in there that got into that kind of left a couple of spots in there, and I was a little reluctant to continue sanding. I wasn't sure if I had more sanding spots, but I'm real happy with the sand, with the red brass, the way that turned out. The through bolt that I ended up fabricated this is just a turn this down to go through the trigger guard and the trigger plate, and then came out on the other side. And of course, I made this a little bit longer, grinded it down so it's a really nice smooth fit. And I probably will go back and have an engraver touch that up so that it'd be like the original. It had a little bit of engraving there. I probably will not do that here, only because I don't want my hand. I smoothed that down. I used stainless steel here, and this was 4mm by 0.7 threading, and I smoothed that down so it's a real smooth finish and it won't catch my hand. If I did some engraving on there, I'm a little worried that from shooting it might catch my finger or something, so I probably won't engrave that. On the trigger guard, I really want to call something out with regards to with Colin Peck. Colin Peck is from England, and although I did not manufacture a furnace, he has this book that you can order, and you can look this up on the internet and get it. And I found this to be extremely helpful to understand how a furnace works. I'm new to casting. This is the only casting I've ever done. That might be one of the most expensive trigger guards that I'm aware of in the state of Texas, the amount of money I spent and time, but I'm very happy with the turnout. But Colin was extremely helpful. I don't know if my Scottish origin, he had a weakness there and decided to go ahead and help me out, but I just want to make a special thanks to Colin in helping me with the furnace and the casting. I had no clue what I was doing, and his book was extremely helpful, as well as a couple of emails to make sure that I was on track with what I should be doing safely and directionally with regards to the spews to get this to fill. Copper, you can get pretty spoiled using aluminum or pewter or ZMAC. It pours like water. Copper, you're going to have to get up, the brass, the red brass, you're going to have to get up to about 18, 19, 2,000 degrees, and then you're going to go a little bit longer. And I don't really have a documented process for that, but it did take me a couple of tries to get this so that when I poured, because the brass starts to cool down very quickly, and so I had several spews coming in to get this to fill in, and then I had several risers to get the air out of there. If the air gets trapped in there, your casting won't complete. So again, a lot of the information is in his book. Extremely helpful. I encourage you, if you're going to do casting, to take a look at this book. So in closing here, one of the comments I also want to make about the casting, these type of guns, the Ithaca and Parkers, L.C. Smiths, these are some pretty old guns. They don't manufacture, although there's some parts out there. I would not be surprised if, now that I'm familiar with casting, that if you did not have a part, or you had the part and it was damaged or needed another one, that I'll have to experiment with that, but it makes me wonder if a lot of these parts could not be cast to repair the gun. Some of my buddies have Parazzis, don't understand why, but their hammers continue to break. Just a thought there. So anyway, that's the project. Pretty happy with the way it turned out. And so now I'll go on to the forum.